History is written by the survivors. But prehistory was written by the gods. Or so they wanted us to believe. When you open the modern Bible, you find a world of faith and redemption. But if you look beneath the surface, if you dig into the dust of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the forbidden pages of the Book of Enoch, you find a world of biological horror. A world where the human race was not the master of the earth, but a species under siege. A low, rhythmic drumbeat starts, mimicking a heartbeat. We have been told the Great Flood was a punishment for sin, a vague moral judgment. But the ancient texts speak of a more clinical reason, a reason rooted in DNA. Before the rain fell, the earth was infested with a lineage that did not belong here. They were the Nephilim. These were not just giants of folklore. They were the physical manifestation of a celestial crime, the offspring of angels who broke the ultimate law of creation to mingle their essence with human women. This was not a moment of rebellion. It was a genetic coup d'etat. They were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. But behind the legends of their strength lies a dark truth that religion has tried to bury for 2,000 years. The Nephilim were a biological hazard, a plague of hybrids that threatened to rewrite the very definition of human. Today, we peel back the veil. We are going to investigate the forensic reasons why God had to erase them. Not because he was angry, but because he was performing a surgery on a dying planet. You are no longer an observer. You are a witness to the forbidden history. Are you ready to discover why the giants had to die? Every war has a beginning. This one started on the summit of Mount Hermon. According to the ancient chronicles, 200 celestial entities, known as the Watchers, looked down from the heavens and saw the daughters of men. But this wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a calculated conspiracy. Led by Semyaza, these entities didn't just fall, they invaded. They stood on that mountain and bound themselves by mutual imprecations, an oath that ensured no one could back out of the crime they were about to commit. They traded their eternal, luminous state for the heavy, tactile constraints of biology. But they didn't come empty-handed. As they descended into the human cities, they brought with them a curriculum of forbidden knowledge designed to corrupt the soul as much as the body. They taught the forging of weapons, the secrets of the stars, and the dark chemistry of roots and sorcery. They were reshaping humanity in their own image before they ever began the hybridization process. The union between these Watchers and human women was a catastrophic violation of cosmic law. The ancient texts describe these pregnancies as traumatic, unnatural events. The children born from these unions were the first Nephilim, beings that possessed the intellect of angels and the primal hunger of man. As they grew, it became clear that they were not part of the ecosystem. They were predators of a scale the earth was never meant to sustain. They began to dominate every aspect of human life, crowning themselves as god-kings and establishing the first empires of blood. The legends of the Golden Age, found in pagan mythologies, are actually the distorted memories of this era. A time when humanity was ruled by high-tech, supernatural tyrants who saw us as nothing more than cattle. This was the protocol of the Watchers: to replace the human race with a hybrid elite. They sought to create a world where nothing was pure anymore. On Mount Hermon, the seal of the original creation was broken, and the genetic countdown to the flood had officially begun. The emergence of the Nephilim was not merely a historical event. It was a biological catastrophe that fundamentally altered the food chain of the ancient world. As these hybrids reached maturity, the earth witnessed the dawn of the cannibal kings, a period defined by a hunger that transcended the limits of nature. To understand why their erasure was a divine necessity, one must first understand the sheer scale of their predation. The Nephilim were not just large men. They were biological anomalies. Possessing the superior intellect of their angelic fathers and the raw physical demands of earthly biology, their metabolic needs were catastrophic. Ancient records, specifically the fragments of the Book of Giants, describe a world where resources were decimated in a matter of years. The hybrids were parasites on a global scale. At first, they consumed the produce of the land, then the livestock of the people. But when the earth could no longer sustain their growth, they turned their insatiable eyes toward the humans who worshiped them. This was the true reign of terror. The Nephilim established a global tyranny where human beings were no longer seen as the image of the Creator, but as a caloric resource. They were the first to implement systematic human sacrifice, not just as a ritual, but as a means of sustenance. This era transformed the cradle of civilization into a slaughterhouse. The men of renown mentioned in Genesis were, in reality, apex predators who viewed the human race as nothing more than livestock. But their consumption wasn't limited to flesh. They were also the architects of a dark, spiritual cannibalism. The Nephilim used the forbidden knowledge of their fathers to establish themselves as god-kings, demanding worship that belonged only to the Most High. They corrupted the social order, creating a hierarchy where violence was the only law. This wasn't just a period of high crime. It was a total ontological collapse. The presence of these hybrids had made human life impossible, as every city became a monument to their ego and every field a graveyard for their meals. The terror reached its peak when the Nephilim began to turn on each other. Fueled by an arrogance that matched their size, they engaged in wars of annihilation that saturated the soil with blood. These were the wars that mythologies later sanitized into the Battle of the Titans, or the Clash of the Gods. In truth, they were the desperate, violent thrashings of a species that was consuming its own environment. Furthermore, the ancient texts suggest that this predation extended to the genetic level. The sinning against birds and beasts was an attempt by the Nephilim to find new sources of energy and new vessels for their corrupted DNA. They were trying to bend all of creation to serve their appetites, turning the earth into a laboratory of chimeras and monstrosities. By the time of the flood, the earth was not just sinful, it was broken. The natural cycle of life had been replaced by a cycle of predation that could only end in total extinction. This is the dark context of the flood. It wasn't an act of divine anger against a few mistakes. It was a surgical intervention against a global cancer. The cannibal kings had turned the earth into a nightmare of blood and bone. If the waters had not risen, there would have been nothing left of the original creation but the cold, empty ruins of a hybrid empire that had eaten itself to death. The erasure of the Nephilim was, in fact, the only way to ensure that life itself could survive. To understand the Great Flood, we must move past the idea of a simple moral judgment and look at it through the lens of a global medical intervention. The common narrative tells us that Noah was chosen because he was a righteous man. While his character was indeed upright, the original Hebrew text of Genesis 6:9 reveals a much more technical, biological reason for his survival. It describes Noah as being perfect in his generations. The Hebrew word used here is tamim. In every other context of ancient scripture, this word is used to describe a sacrificial lamb, a physical specimen that must be without blemish, without defect, and biologically pure. In the context of the pre-flood world, being perfect in his generations meant that Noah's DNA had not been compromised. He was one of the last remaining humans whose ancestry was 100% human, untouched by the genetic infiltration of the Watchers. Noah's family was the final reservoir of the original human blueprint. By this point in history, the Nephilim were not just a few giants living in caves. They were a global dominant species. Their strategy was one of total genetic saturation. The corruption of all flesh mentioned in the texts suggests that the hybridization process had moved beyond the elite and was now infecting the entire population. The goal of the Watchers was simple. If they could contaminate every single human bloodline, the promised seed of the woman, the future redeemer of humanity, could never be born. A hybrid cannot produce a human savior. The world before the flood was a high-stakes hunt for the last untainted genomes. Imagine the pressure on Noah's household. They lived in a high-tech, supernatural civilization where the very air was thick with the influence of the fallen ones. Every other family had likely already succumbed to the benefits of Nephilim DNA. Superior strength, longer life, and forbidden knowledge. To remain pure was not just a moral choice. It was a desperate act of biological resistance. The construction of the ark was more than a maritime project. It was the building of a planetary seed vault. When God commanded Noah to bring the animals after their kind, it was a direct counter-move to the chaotic crossbreeding and chimera-making of the Nephilim. The flood was the reset button. It was a global quarantine designed to drown the genetic infection before it reached the point of no return. If the Creator had waited one more generation, the original human race would have effectively gone extinct, replaced by a planet of monsters who possessed the power of angels but the cruelty of the beasts. The water didn't come to kill humanity. It came to save the very definition of what it means to be human. As the last door of the ark was sealed, it wasn't just a family being protected. It was the entire future of the human genome. But as we will see, the Nephilim were not so easily defeated. They knew the judgment was coming, and they had already begun preparing for the world that would emerge after the storm. The war for the bloodline was only just beginning. To understand why God was forced to intervene, we must dismantle the primitive myth that the pre-flood world was a simple society of hunter-gatherers. According to the ancient records and the architectural anomalies scattered across our planet, the Nephilim were not just warriors. They were the architects of a dark, hyper-advanced technocracy. They didn't just rule through brute strength. They ruled through a curriculum of forbidden knowledge inherited from their celestial fathers. Technology that was never intended for human hands. The Book of Enoch provides a chilling inventory of this technological infusion. It wasn't just about moral sin. It was about the weaponization of the natural world. The Watchers taught men metallurgy, not just to create tools, but to forge standardized weapons of mass slaughter. They revealed the movements of the celestial bodies, which was immediately twisted into advanced astrology and occult systems used to manipulate the masses. They taught the cutting of roots and sorcery, which many modern researchers interpret as an ancient form of advanced pharmacology and genetic engineering. This influx of celestial wisdom led to the construction of a world that defied the laws of physics. Across the globe, from the 800-ton trilithons of Baalbek to the precision-cut stones of Tiwanaku, we see the remnants of an architectural capability that modern machinery still struggles to replicate. The Nephilim were the master builders of these megalithic fortresses, using their immense physical strength combined with a sophisticated understanding of frequency, vibration, and resonance. They erected a global empire of stone and shadow. These weren't just buildings. They were technological markers of their dominion. However, this technology was inherently predatory. The Nephilim used their knowledge to establish a world where they were the undisputed gods. They didn't build for the betterment of humanity. They built to consolidate power and to facilitate their biological experiments. The pre-flood world was a high-tech laboratory where the human race was being systematically marginalized. The might of these men of renown came from a synergy of angelic science and earthly resources, a combination that threatened to break the very boundaries of the universe. As their civilization reached its peak, it became clear that this forbidden technology was destroying the earth itself. The violence that filled the world was empowered by these advanced weapons and the dark arts of manipulation. They were building a world that was technologically superior, but spiritually hollow. A pyramid of power with hybrids at the top and the original human race at the bottom, destined for extinction. This technological rebellion was a primary reason for the flood. God wasn't just destroying a sinful people. He was dismantling a rogue, hybrid-led civilization that had accessed secrets far too dangerous for the mortal realm. The rising waters were a surgical strike against this iron and magic technocracy, designed to bury their cities and their forbidden machines under miles of sediment. The Creator was resetting the clock, ensuring that the human race would have to start again, free, for a time, from the shadow of the architects. But as we will see, these secrets were not entirely lost. They were merely waiting for a new generation of men to go looking for them. The physical destruction of the Nephilim by the waters of the flood was not the end of their influence on earth. It was merely the beginning of a new, invisible chapter in the history of human suffering. To understand the supernatural landscape of our world today, we must address the most profound metaphysical consequence of the Watchers' rebellion: the birth of the demonic realm. In traditional theology, demons are often presented as a vague, malevolent force. But the ancient, extra-biblical texts, specifically the Book of Enoch and the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, provide a terrifyingly logical explanation for their existence. Because the Nephilim were hybrids, beings of mixed celestial and terrestrial essence, their deaths resulted in a spiritual anomaly that the universe was not designed to accommodate. When a pure human being dies, their soul follows a divine path of judgment or rest. When a holy angel falls, Its judgment is reserved for the end of days. But the Nephilim fit neither category. They were bastard spirits. Their bodies were made of the earth, but their spirits were born of the heavens. When the flood crushed their physical forms, their spirits were released, but they were legally and spiritually barred from the halls of the afterlife. They were tethered to the earth, destined to roam its desolate places as disembodied, eternal entities. These are what the ancient scrolls call the evil spirits. They are the ghosts of the giants. The nature of these entities is defined by their origin. Just as the Nephilim were insatiable consumers in the physical world, their disembodied spirits are defined by a perpetual, agonizing hunger. They no longer possess mouths to eat, eyes to see, or bodies to feel, yet the memories of their physical appetites remain. This is why, throughout history, these spirits have sought the same thing: a host. They crave the reclamation of a physical form through possession, seeking to satisfy their celestial-driven desires through human senses. They are parasites of the soul, mourning the loss of the genetic perfection their fathers gave them. Enoch 15 describes them as spirits that oppress, corrupt, and bruise upon the earth. They are not merely fallen angels who are high-ranking celestial rebels, but the lower-level scavengers of the spiritual realm. They are the remnants of a destroyed civilization, a spiritual residue that refuses to fade away. Their mission is a continuation of their father's war, the corruption and eventual destruction of the human race. This realization provides a dark clarity to the ancient world's obsession with exorcism and spiritual protection. The ruins of the pre-flood world were not just empty stones. They were the haunts of these disembodied hybrids, the pagan gods and spirits worshipped by the civilizations that followed the flood were often nothing more than these Nephilim spirits, masquerading as deities to receive the worship and the blood sacrifices they still craved. By understanding the origin of demons as the spirits of the giants, we see the flood in a new, more haunting light. The water cleaned the surface of the planet, but it could not wash away the spirits that the earth itself had been forced to birth. As the human race began to multiply again through the line of Noah, they were entering a world that was already haunted. The genetic infection of the pre-flood era had evolved into a spiritual infection. The war for the earth had moved from the visible realm to the shadows, where the giants would wait for their next chance to take flesh once more. The narrative of the Great Flood often concludes with the total eradication of the Nephilim, suggesting that the rising waters successfully purged the earth of the hybrid infection. However, a closer, more forensic reading of the ancient texts reveals a chilling reality. The giants returned. Genesis 6:4 contains a haunting phrase that history often overlooks. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. This afterward points to a second infiltration, a dark resurgence that has fueled intense theological and historical debate for millennia. If Noah's lineage was genetically pure, how did the hybrid traits reappear in the land of Canaan? The evidence suggests that the war for the human bloodline was far from over. Whether through a second, smaller descent of rebellious watchers or through a recessive genetic trait carried by one of the passengers on the ark, the shadow of the giants began to stretch over the post-Diluvian world once again. This second wave was different. It was more localized, more strategic, and perhaps even more desperate. These were the tribes that the Israelites would later encounter: the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Emim, and the Zamzumim. These were not myths created by frightened desert nomads. They were established, formidable dynasties of hybrids that occupied the most strategic territories of the ancient Near East. The giants of the post-flood era, such as the infamous Og of Bashan or the Anakim of Hebron, were the remnants of the pre-flood genetic experiment. Og, described as the last of the Rephaim, possessed a bedstead of iron nearly 13 feet long. These were the sons of Enoch, who made the Hebrew spies feel like grasshoppers in their sight. This was not mere hyperbole. It was a description of a biological reality that terrified a nation. The land of Canaan was not chosen by God merely for its milk and honey. It was a high-priority target because it had become a stronghold for the resurrected hybrid lineages. The conquest of Canaan was, in essence, a continuation of the Great Flood, a terrestrial mission to complete the biological decontamination of the earth. This explains the total war commands given to the Israelites. Orders to eliminate entire lineages, including women, children, and even livestock. To the modern ear, this sounds barbaric. But through the lens of genetic warfare, it was a desperate measure to prevent the hybrid infection from spreading and compromising the human race once again. These post-flood giants were the architects of the massive fortifications that modern archaeology still struggles to explain. The cyclopean walls of ancient cities and the subterranean fortresses were built by entities who understood that they were being hunted by the heavens. They were a civilization in retreat, clinging to the shadows of history, trying to preserve the forbidden knowledge of their fathers. But the most disturbing aspect of this resurgence is the realization that the giants did not rely solely on physical size. They had learned the value of invisibility. They moved from being overt rulers to being covert influences. They realized that a giant visible on the battlefield can be killed by a stone from a sling, but a bloodline hidden within the halls of power can rule forever. As the era of the great physical giants began to fade, the era of the hidden hybrids, the masters of the shadow, was just beginning. The giants didn't disappear. They simply changed their strategy, waiting for a time when humanity would once again be arrogant enough to open the gates they had so carefully closed. We live in an age of profound historical amnesia, believing that the monsters of the past are safely locked away in the realm of mythology. However, if we examine the current trajectory of human science and the prophetic warnings of ancient texts, a disturbing pattern emerges. The story of the Nephilim is not merely a record of what was. It is a blueprint of what is returning. The final warning of the ancient world was summarized in a single cryptic sentence. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. To understand the days of Noah in the 21st century, we must look beyond morality and focus on biology. As we have explored, the pre-flood world was defined by the systematic corruption of the human genome, the erasure of the boundaries between species, and the fusion of the celestial with the terrestrial. Today, for the first time since the deluge, humanity has rediscovered the keys to the genetic library. We are no longer just observing life, we are rewriting it. The modern push toward transhumanism, CRISPR gene editing, and the creation of synthetic life forms mirrors the forbidden knowledge once whispered by the Watchers. We are currently witnessing the birth of human-animal chimeras in laboratories, where human stem cells are integrated into animal embryos to grow organs or test boundaries. To the modern scientist, this is progress. To the ancient chronicler, this is the sinning against birds and beasts, returning under the guise of medicine. But the infiltration goes deeper. The pursuit of artificial intelligence and the eventual merging of the human mind with new biological substrates represents the ultimate hybrid project. We are seeking to create a new man, a being that is stronger, faster, and more intelligent than the original human blueprint. By doing so, we are effectively inviting a new form of watchers, non-human intelligences, to inhabit our technology and eventually our very biology. We are building the vessels for the return of the disembodied spirits of the giants. The ancient Nephilim were defined by their status as renowned men, the elite who stood above the common human. Today, the global push for a post-human future is driven by a similar elite, those who seek to use technology to bypass death and ascend to godhood. The goal remains the same: the obsolescence of the pure human race. If the image of God is tied to our genetic integrity, then the systematic alteration of that integrity is the ultimate act of war against the Creator. The shadow of the giants is no longer a legend of the desert. It is a reality of the laboratory. We are approaching a genetic singularity, where the line between what is human and what is other will vanish forever. Ancient prophecies suggest that the final kingdom of man will be a mixture, a mirage of iron and clay that cannot hold together. This is the return to the days of Noah, a world so biologically and spiritually corrupted that it necessitates a second, final intervention. The truth was never meant to be hidden forever, but it was meant to serve as a warning. The Nephilim were not just monsters of old. They were a symptom of what happens when the created tries to re-engineer the creation. As we stand on the threshold of this new era, we must ask ourselves, are we creating our own destruction? Are the giants truly dead? Or are they simply waiting for us to finish the work their fathers started? The gates are opening, and this time, there may be no ark to save us.